Try to imagine the Trotter family going on holiday to Italy. They traveled by stagecoach drawn by 4 horses. Of course, the same 4 horses couldn't take them all the way from London to Italy. Teams of horses were kept at post houses set along the road. Most post houses kept 6 teams of horses. When the family arrived at a post house, they stopped for a while, maybe had a meal, and then set off again with a fresh team of 4 horses. A full day of traveling would begin at about 9 a.m. and end 40 to 50 miles later at 3 p.m. Occasionally they set off at 7 a.m. and traveled 20 miles before breakfast, but not often. Lilius was always on the lookout for interesting things, and her sisters were used to her squeals of delight. "Look at those rows of vines," she would say, taking out her drawing pad to do a quick sketch as they trundled by. When people come back from the holiday today, they show their friends all their photos on their phones. Lilius would have shown her friends sketches of the places she'd been to and the things she'd seen. We know she kept holiday sketch pads because some of them still exist to this day. Because Lilius Trotter came from a wealthy family, she didn't have to work, and of course that gave her time to do all sorts of other things. Having spent childhood holidays in Cranmer in Norfolk, one summer when Lilius was in her late 20s, she went back and helped with a summer mission there. Back home in London, the young woman became a member of a Christian choir which sang at mission meetings in the city. Although she didn't have a job, Lilius worked hard at a whole number of things, and all of them had to do with telling others about the Lord Jesus Christ. One special interest was the Welbeck Street Institute. "Tell me about it," she was asked one day by her friend Louisa, who was visiting her home. "Well, it was started by Lady Kennard," began Lilius. "She wanted to help girls who'd come to London to work. They needed somewhere to stay that wouldn't use up all the money that they earned. So, for a small charge, girls get a comfortable place to live and they're not alone. The Welbeck girls are, I guess, a little bit like a club. New girls come along feeling like they know nobody, but before long they're friends with everyone. So it's like a hostel," Louisa said. Lilius thought for a minute. "Well, I suppose you could call it a hostel, but it feels much more like a big home away from home. All sorts of things are organized for the girls. There are French and German lessons, choirs, sewing groups, and most importantly, there are Bible classes for them to come to, and most of them do." Louisa wanted to know where the girls worked. "Oh, some serve in shops, others are dressmakers, many of them are servants in houses." "I'm sure they like what you do for them," said Louisa. "It sounds very worthwhile." Some years later, Lilius was once again in Europe. "October 1876, wrote Lilius at the top of a letter to a friend back home in England. "I'm writing this from a hotel near the St. Gothard Pass on our way from Switzerland to Italy. The views of the Alps are amazing." She drew a quick sketch on the side of the sheet of paper before she started writing again. "I bought a sketchbook at Lucerne, and I'm going to do some sketches in it as we travel to Venice. Looking back at them will remind me of the wonderful countryside we've gone through. The climb up to the St. Gothard Pass was amazing, but boy, those horses must have been so tired. Frankly, I'm tired too. I'll stop now and get back to writing you tomorrow." That sketchbook, which can still be seen today, is full of pencil drawings and watercolor sketches of villages, mountain chalets, forests, Swiss cows, and people in traditional clothes. After they crossed the border into Italy, Lilius continued her artwork, capturing the beautiful lakes at Maggiore and Cuomo in her watercolors. "I can hardly wait to see Venice again," said Mrs. Trotter. "Oh, it's such a wonderful city." Lilius was also very excited. As their stagecoach reached the city, she felt like a teenager rather than a young woman of 23. Before long, she was to feel very embarrassed rather than very excited. Soon after arriving at their hotel, Mrs. Trotter discovered that one of the most famous men in England was staying there too. His name was John Ruskin. He was an artist, an art critic, and a writer. "I would like to show some of your paintings to Mr. Ruskin," Mrs. Trotter told Lilius. "I think you're very good, and I'd love to hear his opinion." "Mother, you can't do that," gasped her daughter. "I just like drawing and painting. I'm not a real artist." Mrs. Trotter had made up her mind. Taking her pen, she sat down at the desk in her sitting room, picked up a sheet of paper with the heading Grand Hotel, Venice, and wrote the date. Completely ignoring Lilius's arguments, she wrote in the style of the day, "Mrs. Alex Trotter has the pleasure of sending Professor Ruskin her daughter's watercolors. Mrs. Trotter is quite prepared to hear what he does not approve of them. She has drawn from childhood and has very little teaching. But if Mrs. Trotter could have Mr. Ruskin's opinion, it would be most valuable." The note was delivered by a maid to the great man. When John Ruskin read it, he nearly went into a sulk. "I'm in Italy," he moaned. "I don't want to spend my holiday being polite to English mothers who think their very average daughters are very great artists. In any case, great artists are all men, not women." Despite feeling cross, John Ruskin decided to be polite and sent a letter back, agreeing to see some of Lilius's paintings. The young woman struggled to decide which ones to send, and then gave a few to the maid. Imagine how she felt knowing that the greatest art critic in England was looking at her work. After what seemed like a long time, the maid knocked at her door and handed in a letter. It was an invitation to Lilius to go out sketching with John Ruskin. The next day, with her sketch pad, pencils, and watercolor paints neatly packed, Lilius set off, along with her mother and John Ruskin, to the lovely Abbey of San Gregorio. "Draw that, Miss Trotter," he said. Lilius looked at the abbey. It was very beautiful. "Not the abbey," the artist told her. "Draw that piece of marble." Lilius looked at the marble and then looked more closely. At first, it just seemed like a piece of gray stone, but after a few minutes, the young woman could see veins of different colors and changes in the texture of the stone. Mr. Ruskin was pleased to see that his new pupil didn't rush to draw or paint, but sat looking at her subject for some time before starting. What Lilius perhaps didn't know at the time was that John Ruskin had written a whole book called Stones of Venice. He was a real expert. That day was very special for Lilius, but it was very special for the great artist, too. Before then, he had truly thought that women couldn't paint or draw as well as men. He'd even told his students that, too. In fact, all of his students were men. Later, in a lecture he gave at Oxford, this is what he said about his first meeting with Lilius Trotter. "For a long time I used to say that, except in a graceful or minor way, women could not paint or draw. I'm beginning to bow myself to the much more delightful conviction that no one else can. You see, when I was in Venice in 1876, 2 English ladies, mother and daughter, were staying at the same hotel. One day the mother sent me a pretty note asking if I would look at the ladies' drawings. On my somewhat sulky permission, a few were sent, in which I saw there was extremely right-minded and careful work. I sent back a request that the young lady might be allowed to come out sketching with me. She seemed to learn everything the instant she was shown it." What a holiday that turned out to be. The famous John Ruskin took Mrs. Trotter and Lilius all over Venice, telling them the history of the city as they went from place to place. "Today we're going along the Grand Canal," he told them one morning, "and you'll sketch as we go." There was no time for long looks at things as their gondola went along the canal, and John Ruskin was delighted to see that his young friend was able to do quick sketches very accurately, too. The following day dawned sunny. "Today is the perfect day for the piazza and the square of St. Mark's," the women were told. Lilias felt as if she was walking on air. She'd only had a few art lessons as a child, and here she was, being taken on a sketching tour of one of the most beautiful cities in the world by one of the best artists in the world. If she thought she was dreaming, she was wrong. John Ruskin had a studio in Venice, and he took the two women to see it. "Do you recognize that painting?" he asked. Lilias had spent many, many hours in art galleries and reading books about art history. She knew that the painting Mr. Ruskin was working on was a copy of one called St. Ursula's Dream by Carpaccio. He allowed her to examine his work very carefully, to see the angles of his brushstrokes and how he mixed his colors. It was like a whole university course for her.